The first thing you notice is not the silk, nor the jade. It is not the intricate lattice of the window, framing a garden where every rock and willow has been placed within human precision. It is your own scent. It rises from your skin, unbiddened perfume of apricot and sandalwood that has defined your existence. To others it is a miracle, a myth made flesh. To you, it is the signature on your cage. You are in the heart of the Forbidden City, the personal property of the Son of Heaven, the Qianlong Emperor. The air here is heavy with its own smells, the cloying sweetness of plum blossoms, the sharp tang of ancient cypress wood, the cold, sterile scent of polished stone. But your fragrance cuts through it all, announcing your presence, reminding your keepers why you are here. You are not a political hostage in the traditional sense. You are a collectible. The rarest of treasures in an empire of treasures, an olfactory phenomenon to be owned, controlled, and occasionally visited by the one man who holds the world in his hands. You are the fragrant concubine, and this gilded, silent pavilion is your exquisitely beautiful, eternal prison. This is the legend at least. The story whispered in tea houses and immortalized in poems, a tale of obsessive desire and tragic defiance. So, before we bear witness to what truly happened, take a moment to light a candle with a like and subscribe to stand with us. But only if you feel compelled to remember the stories that the world has tried to forget. In the comments below, share your thoughts on who you believe to be the most misunderstood figure in history. So, clear your table, adjust your reading lamp, and let's open the sealed file together. To understand the nature of this particular prison, one must first understand the prison itself. The Forbidden City, known in Chinese as Zhai was not merely a palace. It was a self-contained cosmos, a walled city within a city, covering 180 acres and containing nearly 1,000 buildings. For over 500 years, it was the unwavering center of the Chinese universe. Its gates and halls aligned with celestial and philosophical principles. The outer court was the realm of masculine, public power, where the emperor performed his state rituals. But deeper within, past the gate of heavenly purity, lay the inner court. This was a different world, a domestic space on an imperial scale, and it was here that the emperor, his empress, and his vast retinue of concubines lived. The imperial harem of the Qing dynasty was a highly structured and bureaucratic institution. It was a hierarchy as formal and inflexible as any government ministry. At its apex was the Empress Dowager, followed by the Empress. Below them were the imperial noble consorts, imperial concubines, noble ladies, first-class attendants, and second-class attendants. Each rank came with a specific stipend of silver, rice, and bolts of silk. Its own designated retinue of servants and eunuchs. It was a system designed to regulate imperial reproduction, manage state alliances, and, above all, to maintain order. The lives of the thousands of women within were governed by protocol, precedent, and the unblinking surveillance of the palace eunuchs. It was into this meticulously organized, insular world that the woman who would become a legend was introduced. Her arrival was an anomaly. She was not a Manchu noblewoman, nor was she Han Chinese, the two dominant ethnic groups of the empire. She was a foreigner, a war prize from the newly conquered western territories of Altisha, what modern geography calls the Tarim Basin. Her presence in the inner court was a physical symbol of the emperor's military triumph, a living testament to the expansion of the Qing frontier to its greatest historical extent. But it was not her exotic origin alone that set her apart, it was the attribute that gave her her name. According to the legend that solidified over the centuries, she possessed a natural, intoxicating bodily fragrance, an aroma so unique that it captivated the emperor completely. This singular quality, whether real or imagined, became the defining feature of her captivity. The Emperor Qianlong, a man of immense aesthetic appetites, was known for his obsession with collecting. His palaces were filled with the world's finest jades, porcelains, paintings, and calligraphies. He was a connoisseur of supreme power, able to acquire any object he desired. In this context, the fragrant concubine was not simply a woman, she was the ultimate acquisition. She was a human artifact whose value lay in her unique sensory property. All the luxuries lavished upon here a private pavilion, custom-made clothing, the rarest foods were not gestures of love in a conventional sense. They were the actions of a curator placing a priceless object in a perfect display case. Her comfort was essential, but only in the way a stable climate is essential for a fragile scroll painting. Her happiness was secondary to her preservation. Her prison was therefore psychological and cultural, far more than it was physical. She was surrounded by women with whom she shared no common language or history. She was attended by eunuchs who were both her servants and her wardens. Every aspect of her life, from the moment she woke to the moment she slept, was managed and observed. The very scent that made her an object of imperial fascination also isolated her, marking her as irredeemably other. Her defining characteristic was an involuntary, uncontrollable deviation from the norm. It was a trait she could not hide, a part of her very biology that had been repurposed as the lock on her gilded cage. This was not a prison of stone walls and iron bars, but one of silk, jasmine tea, and profound, unending solitude. The architect of this specific confinement was a man for whom the concept of limits was largely theoretical. The Qianlong Emperor, born Hongli, ascended the dragon throne in 1735 and would go on to preside over one of the longest reigns in Chinese history, a period of 60 years that is often regarded as the apex of the Qing dynasty's power and prestige. To the outside world, and indeed to many of his subjects, his era was one of unprecedented peace and prosperity, a golden age of cultural achievement and territorial expansion. His authority was not simply political, it was absolute, woven into the fabric of cosmology, bureaucracy, and military might. He was the son of heaven, and his will was the engine of the state. Territorially, the empire under Qianlong reached its maximum extent. His 10 great campaigns, a series of military expeditions launched throughout his reign, consolidated and expanded Qing control over vast swaths of Inner Asia. He finalized the subjugation of the Dzunga Mongols, effectively eliminating the last great nomadic threat from the steppe. He solidified the imperial protectorate over Tibet and reinforced king dominion over Mongolia. His armies pushed into modern days in Jiang, the very region from which the Fragrant Concubine would be taken, bringing it under direct imperial administration for the first time and incorporating millions of square kilometers on Han populations into the empire. The geographic scale of his domain was staggering, stretching from the Siberian forests to the tropics of Southeast Asia, from the Pacific Ocean to the Pamir Mountains. He governed a population that swelled to an estimated 300 million people, a significant portion of the entire human species at the time. This immense physical control was managed through a highly sophisticated and centralized bureaucratic machine that his father, the Qianlong Emperor, had perfected. The key instrument of Qianlong's personal rule was the Grand Council, the Zhengjitu. This was a small, informal body of his most trusted officials that met with him daily, often at dawn. Unlike the larger, more ceremonial Grand Secretariat, the Grand Council operated with speed and secrecy, serving as an imperial command center that bypassed traditional bureaucratic channels. Memorials and reports from every province flowed directly to the emperor's desk. He would review them personally, often writing his responses directly onto the documents in vermilion ink. These vermilion endorsements were law. This system allowed him to act as his own prime minister, micromanaging affairs from military logistics on the frontier to grain prices in a distant southern province, and all lines of information led directly to him. Ideologically, his position was unassailable. The mandate of heaven conferred upon him a quasi-divine status. He was the indispensable link between the celestial order and the human world. His rituals, his pronouncements, and even his personal conduct were believed to have a direct impact on the harmony of the cosmos, influencing harvests, preventing natural disasters, and ensuring the well-being of his people. Disobedience to the emperor was not merely a political crime, it was an act of cosmic defiance, a disruption of the natural order that invited chaos. This ideological framework provided a profound justification for his absolute power, placing him beyond the reproach of ordinary mortals. Yet, this power was expressed not only through military force and political decree, but also through a massive, state-sponsored campaign of cultural curation. Qianlong was perhaps the most prolific art collector and patron in human history. He saw himself as the preserver and arbiter of Chinese civilization. This impulse led to the creation of the Saiku Quanshu, the complete library of the four treasuries. This was a gargantuan project to assemble, edit, and hand-copy all of the most significant works of Chinese literature, history, and philosophy. The final collection comprised over 36,000 volumes. However, this act of cultural preservation had a deeply sinister corollary. The process of gathering these texts from across the empire was simultaneously a literary inquisition. Any book containing sentiments, deemed critical of the ruling Manchu, deviating from state-sanctioned orthodoxy, was marked for destruction. 300 works were completely expunged, while thousands more were censored. The authors of these forbidden texts, even if long dead, were posthumously punished, and their living descendants could be arrested, enslaved, or executed. The Qianlong Emperor's passion for culture was inseparable from his demand for absolute control. He collected what he valued and systematically destroyed what he did not. This was the mentality of the man who would soon turn his gaze from texts and artifacts to a living woman from a newly conquered land. While the emperor consolidated his power within the symmetrical, ordered world of Beijing, the empire's western periphery was a landscape of chronic instability. The territory that would become known as Xinjiang, or New Dominion, was not a vacuum waiting to be filled by king authority. It was for centuries a complex and contested space dominated by two distinct but intertwined political entities, the Xiong'er political entities, the Xiong'er Khanate to the north and Daltishah, the land of the six cities to the south. The fate of the woman who would become the Fragrant Concubine was forged in the violent crucible of their relationship. The Xiong'er Khanate was the last great nomadic empire to challenge a Chinese dynasty. An alliance of Iraq Mongol tribes, the Xiong'er had forged a powerful state in the lands north of the Tian Shan Mountains, in a region known as Dzong. From their capital on the Ili River, they controlled crucial pastures and commanded a formidable cavalry army that made them the undisputed hegemonic power in Central Asia throughout the late 17th and early 18th century. They were not merely a tribal confederation, they were an imperial project in their own right, with ambitions that clashed directly with those of the king. For 3 generations of King Emperors Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, the Xiong'er problem was a paramount security concern, a source of constant friction and intermittent warfare along the Mongolian frontier. South of the Qianshan Mountains, in the arid Tarim Basin, lay Daltishah. This was a network of fertile oases, city-states Kashgar, Wyarkand, Khotan, and others inhabited by a sedentary, Turkic-speaking population that practiced Islam. These cities were the vital nodes of the ancient Silk Road, rich with agriculture, craftsmanship, and commerce. They were a world away, culturally and geographically, from the nomadic, Tibetan Buddhist society of the Xiong'er. Yet, since the 1682, Daltishah had been under the thumb of the Xiong'er Khanate. The relationship was one of colonial subjugation. The Xiong'er treated the oases as an extractive reservoir of wealth, imposing heavy taxes and levies of grain, cotton, and gold to finance their state and military. Xiong'er rule was maintained through a system of indirect control that exploited deep existing fissures within Daltishah's society. The political and religious life of the region was dominated by 2 rival lineages of Sufi masters known as the Ode, as the Afaqi faction and the Ashaki faction. These 2 groups vied for the spiritual and temporal loyalty of the populace, and their rivalry was often bitter and violent. The Xiong'er skillfully played one faction against the other, propping up whichever Khoja leader was willing to collaborate with them in exchange for local authority. They held members of the Khoja families as hostages at their court in Ili, installing them as puppet rulers in Kashgar and Wyarkand as political expediency required. This created a permanent state of internal division, preventing the people of Daltishah from forming a united front against their nomadic overlords. For decades, this volatile but stable system persisted. The king watched from a distance, contained by the Xiong'er military strength. The situation changed dramatically in 1745 with the death of the Xiong'er ruler, Galdan Xiren. His passing precipitated a catastrophic succession crisis that spiraled into a full-blown civil war. Competing princes, backed by different tribal factions, tore the Khanate apart. Disease and famine followed the political collapse, decimating the De's younger population. The internal implosion of the king's greatest rival presented Qianlong with an opportunity his ancestors could only have dreamed of. It was a moment of profound geopolitical significance, a chance to resolve the empire's western security problem permanently and to project king power deep into the heart of Central Asia. In 1752, a Desi younger noble named immersion, having lost out in the power struggle, defected to the king and formally submitted to the Qianlong Emperor. He pleaded for imperial assistance to reclaim his position, offering his allegiance in return. This was the final justification Qianlong needed. He now had a legitimate pretext for intervention and a knowledgeable local guide. The complex web of alliances and animosities, the long history of subjugation and resistance, and the sudden political vacuum created by the De's Indo-Civil War had set the stage. The emperor was not simply marching into a peaceful territory, he was stepping into a chaotic power struggle, ready to impose his own final order. From this impending campaign of pacification, the king state would emerge with new lands, new subjects, and one particularly famous captive. The emperor's decision to intervene in the De's younger civil war was a calculated act of geopolitical strategy. But the mentality that would shape the consequences of that intervention was deeply personal. To understand what happened to the woman from Alti-Shah, one must first understand that the Qianlong Emperor was, above all else, a collector. This was not a casual hobby or a refined pastime, it was a core component of his identity, a compulsive and systematic drive to acquire, catalog, and possess the entirety of the world's treasures, both cultural and natural. His reign was not just a period of military conquest, it was an era of insatiable acquisitiveness, and his empire was, in many ways, his personal collection. Under his direction, the imperial collections swelled to an unprecedented magnitude. The Forbidden City and his various summer palaces became vast repositories for the finest artifacts ever produced. He amassed an enormous quantity of paintings with masterpieces from the Tang, Song, and Yuan dynasties. His calligraphy collection was unparalleled, centered around legendary works like the timely clearing after snowfall by the sage of calligraphy, Wang Shizi. He gathered archaic bronzes from the Shang and Zhou dynasties, lustrous ceramics from the Song, and exquisite jades from every period of Chinese history. His interest was not confined to traditional Chinese arts. He was also fascinated by European craftsmanship, particularly the intricate mechanical clocks and automata brought to the court by Jesuit missionaries, amassing a collection that was the wonder of his age. But Qianlong was not a passive custodian of these treasures. His engagement with them was an active, interventionist, and deeply proprietary act. The most telling, and to later art historians, the most controversial aspect of his collecting was his habit of adding his own mark to the objects he acquired. He was a prolific, if not universally celebrated, poet, and he would compose thousands of verses inspired by the items in his collection. He would then order court artisans to physically incise these poems, along with his numerous imperial seals, directly onto the surfaces of priceless ancient jade, into the empty spaces of irreplaceable scroll paintings. This act was far more than simple appreciation. It was a form of intellectual and aesthetic domination. By carving his words onto a 2000-year-old jade artifact, he was inserting himself into its history, making his own connoisseurship a permanent and unavoidable part of the object's identity. The original artist's voice was now forced to share space with the emperor's commentary. It was an act of profound historical appropriation, a declaration that the object's meaning and value were ultimately determined and validated by him. He did not simply admire the past, he assimilated it, rebranding it with the insignia of his own imperial taste. This impulse to order and control extended to the cataloguing of his collections. He commissioned immense, multi-volume illustrated catalogues for his holdings in ceramics, bronzes, and paintings. These were not mere inventories. They were scholarly projects that classified, ranked, and graded each piece, imposing a rigid imperial hierarchy on the world of art. An object's inclusion in the catalogue, its show due or reception by the emperor, conferred upon it a final, unimpeachable status. The line between ruler, curator, and collector dissolved. The entire cultural patrimony of the nation was being filtered through the single lens of his judgment. This psychological framework is essential for understanding the events that followed the conquest of Alti Shah. For a man who viewed the world in terms of things to be acquired, the subjugation of a new territory was indistinguishable from an acquisition expedition. The land, its resources, and its people were all, in a sense, new items for the imperial inventory. When reports filtered back to the court, they would have detailed not only military victories and strategic assets, but also the unique products and curiosities of the region. It is within this context that one must place the whispers of a woman with an extraordinary natural perfume to a ruler who had spent a lifetime seeking out the rarest and most unique objects. Such a person would not have been perceived primarily as a human being. She would have registered as a phenomenon, a living treasure, a biological artifact whose singular quality made her eminently collectible. The same impulse that drove him to possess the perfect celadon vase or to inscribe his seal on a masterwork of calligraphy would naturally extend to a woman whose very body was a source of wonder. She was the ultimate prize, a human curiosity to be acquired, catalogued, and displayed in the most exclusive gallery on earth, the inner court of the Forbidden City. Information, in the 18th century, moved at the speed of a horse, but it was subject to the same distortions as a landscape viewed from a galloping saddle. As the king armies prepared to march west, dispatches, reports, and informal accounts began the long journey back to the capital. These were practical documents concerned with logistics, troop movements, and the political alliances and betrayals. They were the raw data of empire building. But alongside the official reports, a different kind of intelligence travels: rumor, folklore, and the embellishments of soldiers' tales. It was likely in this murky confluence of fact and fiction that the story of the Fragrant Concubine first took root. The legend in its most developed form is specific. It describes a young woman often identified as the consort of a local Koja leader, who was born with an inexplicable and enchanting bodily fragrance. This was not the result of applied perfumes or sachets of herbs, but an intrinsic, biological effluence, a scent said to combine the notes of apricot blossoms, sandalwood, and desert jujubes. The fragrance was reportedly so potent the very air around her was perfumed, and the clothes she wore retained the scent for weeks. Butterflies and bees were said to be drawn to her as if she were a flower. It was a story that sounded more like a passage from a supernatural tale than a military field report. From a historical perspective, the literal truth of this fragrance is less significant than the function the story served. The historical record, unsurprisingly, offers no verifiable evidence for such a condition. No official king document from the period of the conquest mentions it. Its significance lies not in its biological possibility, but in its cultural and political utility. The story of the scent was a powerful narrative device that served multiple purposes simultaneously. First, it was the ultimate marker of exoticist. For the court in Beijing, the lands of Alti Shah were a remote and mysterious periphery. The story of a naturally fragrant woman was a perfect distillation of this foreigners. It transformed the abstract concept of a newly conquered territory into a tangible, sensory marvel. She became the olfactory symbol of the West, a human embodiment of the strange and wondrous things the empire now possessed. The scent made her irreducibly other, packaging her for an identity in a way that was non-minus threatening and aesthetically pleasing. Second, the attribute of scent inherently objectified its source. A person can be engaged with through their intellect, their actions, or their character. A scent, however, is a passive quality to be experienced by others. The narrative of the fragrance preemptively dehumanized her, transforming her from a political captive with a personal history of trauma and displacement into a natural curiosity. She was framed not as a person but as a phenomenon. This placed her in the same category as a singing bird, a uniquely colored gemstone, or a strangely shaped fruit. It made her an object of connoisseurship, something to be appreciated for its rare quality, rather than a human being whose consent or well-minded being was a primary concern. Finally, the narrative of the miraculous scent was perfectly calibrated, whether by accident or design, to the known psychology of its intended audience, the emperor himself. Qianlong, the obsessive collector, had spent his life in pursuit of the unique, the rare, and the perfect. A report of a woman who was a biological work of art would have been irresistible. It appealed directly to his desire to possess things that no one else in the world could have. The story may well have been an embellishment, a piece of strategic flattery designed by an official or commander on the frontier to curry favor with the throne. By identifying such a treasure and securing it for the emperor, a subordinate could demonstrate his loyalty and his refined understanding of the imperial taste. Whether the scent was a complete fabrication, an exaggeration of a fondness for perfumes, or a genuine but misunderstood physical trait, is ultimately unknowable and, to the historian, irrelevant. The rumor itself became the fact of consequence. It traveled faster than she did, arriving in the forbidden city long before her physical journey began. It created a category for her, a label that would precede and define her. Before she was ever seen by the emperor, she was already known as the Fragrant Concubine. A space had already been prepared for her in the emperor's grand collection. All that remained was the physical act of acquisition. The imperial ambition, having been inflamed by rumor, required a physical mechanism for its fulfillment. That mechanism was the Qing military machine, a vast and complex instrument that the Qianlong Emperor was about to deploy with decisive force. In the spring of 1755, he ordered the campaign. The official objective was the pacification of the Xi territories and the final resolution of the generations-old threat they posed. The emperor presented it as an act of restoring order, a righteous intervention to end the Xi civil war and liberate the peoples they subjugated. Two large armies, numbering around 50,000 men in total, marched west. They were a multi-ethnic imperial force, composed of Manchu bannermen, Mongol cavalry loyal to the king, and Han Chinese Green Standard infantry, a testament to the empire's ability to mobilize diverse populations for a single purpose. The initial phase of the campaign was astonishingly swift and successful. Led by the experienced General Bandi, the Qing forces advanced into the Ili River Valley, the heartland of the Xi Khanate. The Xi leadership, fractured by internal conflict, was incapable of mounting a unified defense. Many Xi nobles, seeing the futility of resistance, surrendered to the Qing forces without a fight. Within months, the Qing army had captured the Xi capital of Gulyao and taken the ruling Quan Dorkai prisoner. The Xi Khanate, which had been the Qing's primary strategic rival for nearly a century, had effectively collapsed. As part of this campaign, the Qing armies also liberated the Afaqi Koja brothers, the Han al-Din and Qiyam-Ayahon, who had been held hostage by the Xi ris, and reinstalled them as rulers al-Altishar, intending for them to govern as loyal vassals. However, the initial victory proved to be an illusion of stability. The king had underestimated the ambitions of their own allies. Immersion, the Xi noble who had defected and guided the Qing invasion, had no intention of being a puppet. He coveted the title of Khan over all the Irot Mongols. When Qianlong refused to grant him this, Immersion rebelled, igniting a new and far more brutal phase of the conflict. Simultaneously, in Altishar, the Koja brothers saw the chaos to the north as an opportunity. Having consolidated their power base in Kashgrand Yarkand, they renounced their allegiance to the king, murdered the emperor's representatives, and declared an independent state. The Qianlong Emperor's response to these betrayals was swift and utterly ruthless. What had begun as a campaign of pacification now became a war of extermination. His directives regarding the Xi res were unequivocal, amounting to a policy of state-sponsored genocide. He ordered his generals to show no mercy, to kill all Xi males capable of bearing arms, and to enslave their women and children for distribution among the loyal Mongol and Manchu soldiers. The ensuing campaigns, which lasted until 1750, were methodical and brutal. A combination of military action, a smallpox epidemic, and the destruction of their food sources resulted in the near-total annihilation of the Xi people. Contemporary estimates suggest that their population of around 600,000 was reduced by as much as 80%. The once mighty Xi Khanate was not merely defeated, it was erased from the map. With the Xi threat permanently eliminated, the emperor turned his full attention to the rebellious soldiers in Altishar. General Xiao Hui, who had distinguished himself in the northern campaigns, was dispatched south of the Tian Shan Mountains. This was a war fought in a different, and in many ways more difficult environment. The Qing army, accustomed to the steppes, now had to maintain long supply lines across the vast and unforgiving Taklamakan Desert, fighting a determined enemy in a series of fortified oasis cities. The campaign against the Oghurs was a slow, grinding affair. General Xiao Hui's forces besieged the key cities of Waiokand and Kashgar, facing fierce resistance. Yet the logistical and military superiority of the Qing state was overwhelming. By 1759, the Oghurs' armies were broken. Bahanao-Din and Kuai-Ayahon, along with their remaining followers and families, fled southwest, seeking refuge in the mountainous terrain of Bodokon, in modern-day Afghanistan. But there was no escape from the emperor's reach. Qianlong dispatched envoys to the Sultan of Bodokon, demanding that the fugitives be handed over. The Sultan, intimidated by the immense power of the Qing Empire, complied. He captured and executed the Kojia brothers, sending their heads to Beijing as a gruesome token of his submission. The conquest was complete. The entire region from Dezhong area to the Tarim Basin was now firmly under the administration of the Qing dynasty. The process of pacification was over. The process of collecting the spoils of war was about to begin. With the military objectives achieved and the heads of the rebel leaders delivered, the Qing state began the systematic process of consolidating its new territory. This was a bureaucratic procedure, an exercise in calculations and identifying individuals of political significance who had been captured during the final stages of the conflict. It was during this administrative inventory, conducted by General Xiao Hui's officers, that the legend of the fragrant woman and the reality of a specific high-better captive began to converge. The historical record identifies the woman as the wife of the younger rebel leader, Kuai-Ayahon. Some sources suggest she was captured directly during the fall of Kashgar or Waiokand. A more dramatic and more commonly cited version of the story holds that she was taken, along with other members of the Kojia family, after the final pursuit into Bodokon. In this account, her husband had been killed, leaving her a widow and, more importantly in the eyes of the king, a direct symbol of the defeated rebellion. Her high social standing made her a prize of significant political value. As the consort of a rebel prince, her transfer to the imperial capital would serve as a living demonstration of the emperor's total victory. It is at this critical juncture that the narrative of her unique scent likely became an official reality, at least for the purpose of imperial correspondence. Whether General Xiao Hui or one of his subordinates had heard the pre-existing rumors, or whether they invented the story as a way of enhancing the value of their captive, is impossible to know. What is certain is that presenting her to the emperor as a mere political prisoner was one thing, presenting her as a miraculous human treasure was quite another. The latter was a gift tailored specifically to the emperor's known passions, a way for a general in the field to display not just military prowess, but also a refined and sycophantic understanding of his sovereign's desires. The identification process, therefore, was twofold. On one level, she was officially catalogued as a member of the Kojia clan, a political entity. Her name, her lineage, and her relationship to the defeated rebels were noted for the imperial records. She was classified, in the cold calculus of statecraft, as an asset. The women of a conquered enemy's family were routinely taken as spoils of war. Many would be distributed as wives or servants to meritorious officers and soldiers. Others of higher rank might be sent to the capital. There was a clear and established protocol for this. On another, more potent level, her special quality was identified and reported. This transformed her from a standard political captive into a unique prize. The reports sent back to Beijing would have been carefully worded. It would have framed the discovery not as a mere rumor, but as an observed fact, a wonder of nature and covered in the course of pacifying the new territories. The description would have been designed to pique the emperor's curiosity, to engage his collector's instinct. It would have presented her as a rarity on par with a flawless piece of white jade or a legendary painting, something that only the Son of Heaven was worthy of possessing. This act of identification sealed her fate. She was no longer just another war captive destined for an uncertain future in the imperial household system. She was now a specific object of the emperor's desire, pre-minus selected and reserved for his personal collection. The bureaucratic machinery of the state was then engaged to facilitate the transfer. An order would have been dispatched from the Grand Council in Beijing, over 1,000 miles away, bearing the emperor's vermilion command. The order would have specified her name and status and decreed her transport to the capital. She was now officially designated as imperial property. Her personal identity, her history, and her recent trauma witnessing the collapse of her society, the death of her husband, and the destruction of her family were all rendered secondary to the two facts that now defined her existence for the king state. First, she was the wife of a defeated rebel. Second, and far more consequential, she was rumored to possess an enchanting, otherworldly scent. She was singled out from the anonymous mass of the conquered and began the long, involuntary journey that would take her from the deserts of Central Asia to the very heart of imperial power. The execution of the imperial command was a demonstration of the king-state's logistical reach and bureaucratic efficiency. For the subject of the command, it was the beginning of a profound and irreversible translocation. The journey from Kashgar to Beijing was a physical passage of nearly 3,000 miles, but it was also a crossing of entire worlds, a forced march from the cultural and geographical periphery of the empire to its absolute center. This was not a journey of a diplomat or a merchant, it was a supervised delivery of a human asset. The convoy would have been organized with military precision. At its core was the captive herself, likely housed in an enclosed carriage or a heavily curtained cart. This was both a security measure and a practical necessity. It protected her from the elements and the public gaze, but it also served as a mobile prison, isolating her from the world through which she was passing. She would have been attended by a retinue of servants, possibly some of her own who worked aptured with her. But the entire entourage was under the command of a king military officer. The escort would have been substantial, composed of Manchu or Mongol cavalry, their presence a constant and visible reminder of the authority that now governed her every move. As the convoy prepared to enter the more populated provinces of Inner China, it is likely that one or more eunuchs, dispatched from the imperial household department, would have joined it to assume direct oversight. They were the specialists in the protocols of the inner court, and their arrival would have signaled the final stage of her transfer from military prize to imperial property. The route itself was a brutal education in the scale of her new reality. The initial stages would have taken her out of the Tarim Basin, the arid landscape of her birth, and into the Gansu corridor. This was a narrow, 1,000-kilometer long passage flanked by mountains to the south and deserts to the north, the historic artery connecting China proper to Central Asia. For weeks, the view from her carriage, if she were permitted one, would have been one of dust, rock, and a seemingly infinite horizon. The convoy would have moved between fortified garrisons and postal relay stations, a network of imperial infrastructure that made such a long-distance transfer possible. At each stop, fresh horses, supplies, and guards would be waiting, the system operating with an impersonal and inexorable momentum. As the convoy moved east, the landscape would have begun to change dramatically. The arid clarity of the desert air would have given way to the fine, yellow dust of the lowest plateau, and then to the more humid, greener plains of the North China Plain. The languages she heard in the way stations would have shifted from the Turkic tongues of her home to various dialects of Chinese. The food, the style of dress, the very architecture of the buildings, every sensory input would have reinforced her profound alienation. She was a native of the oasis, a product of a world shaped by Islam's Central Asian traditions. She was being transported into the heart of a Confucian bureaucratic empire state. The psychological impact of this journey is difficult to overstate. It was an extended exercise in sensory and social deprivation. Confined to her carriage for much of the day, she would have been severed from any familiar context. The rhythm of the wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the barked commands of the soldiers in a language she did not understand would have been the soundtrack to her slow erasua. She was a recent widow whose people had just been violently subjugated. The journey offered no time for grief or recovery. It was a continuation of her trauma, a state of perpetual powerlessness and uncertainty. She was moving toward a destination and a fate that were entirely unknown to her, chosen for her by a man she had never met, for reasons she could only guess at. After months on the road, the convoy would have approached the metropolitan region of Qianlong, the province surrounding the capital. The traffic on the roads would have thickened with merchant caravans, official couriers, and peasant carts. The scale of human activity would have been unlike anything in the sparsely populated oases of her homeland. Finally, the walls of Beijing would have appeared on the horizon 40 feet high, 60 feet thick at the base, a colossal statement of imperial power. Passing through the massive outer gates, she would have entered a city teeming with a million souls, the largest and most complex urban environment on the planet. But her journey was not over. The convoy would have navigated the crowded streets, heading for the city's heart, for the final set of walls, moats, and gates that enclosed her ultimate destination, the Forbidden City. The long march was ending, but her true confinement was just beginning. The final approach to the Forbidden City was a passage through a series of ideological and physical filters. For the woman in the carriage, the imposing walls of Beijing were merely the first membrane. Her convoy passed through the city's ordered chaos to arrive before an even more formidable barrier, the Meridian Gate, the Wumen, the southern and primary entrance to the imperial palace. A monumental piece of architecture designed to project overwhelming power and to enforce a rigid hierarchy. Its 5 archways were not created equal. The central, largest passage was reserved for the emperor alone. Her escort, like all other officials and lesser nobility, would have been required to use one of the smaller, subordinate side arches. This was her first, unspoken lesson in the syntax of imperial space. Everyone had their place, and hers was not at the center. Once inside the gate, the world changed instantly and completely. The noise and grit of the city vanished, replaced by an immense, almost oppressive silence. Before her lay a vast, stone-minus paved courtyard, bisected by the meandering golden water river with its 5 marble bridges. In the distance, rising from a triple-tiered marble terrace, was the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the largest wooden building in China, its yellow-alt roof seeming to touch the sky. The scale of the architecture was inhuman, engineered to diminish the individual and exalt the institution of the throne. The effect was one of profound psychological displacement, an immediate and visceral understanding of one's own insignificance in the imperial cosmos. Here, in this great outer court, the final handover took place. The military escort, their duty now complete, formally relinquished their charge. They were soldiers, men of the outside world, and their jurisdiction ended at the palace gates. Authority was transferred to a new group of functionaries who emerged to meet the convoy, the palace eunuchs. These were the true administrators of the Forbidden City, the permanent staff of the Imperial Household Department, the Nei Wufu. Dressed in their prescribed silk robes, they moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. Their faces were impassive, their manner professional and detached. They were not warriors, they were bureaucrats of a closed system, and she was now a matter of their administration. Her former identity as a war prize was formally dissolved. She was now an incoming resident of the inner court, and she was processed accordingly. She would have been led, not down the grand central axis reserved for the emperor and state ceremony, but through a series of side gates and less imposing corridors, a route that reinforced her status. The journey took her past the great ceremonial halls of the outer court, the realm of statecraft, audiences, and masculine power places she would never enter. She was being guided deeper into the palace complex toward the gate of heavenly purity, the formal boundary that separated the public, administrative sphere from the emperor's private, domestic world. Crossing this threshold was the true point of no return. The inner court was a labyrinth of smaller palaces, gardens, and courtyards, while the architecture was different, more intimate, yet somehow more confining. This was the domain of the empress, the consorts, and the thousands of women and eunuchs who served them. Surveillance, here was constant and total. Every word spoken, every visit made was noted and potentially reported. It was a world governed by intricate rules of etiquette, precedent, and precedence. Her first stop within the inner court would have been at one of the administrative offices of the Imperial Household Department. Here, The bureaucratic assimilation was completed. Her name was entered into the imperial registers. She was assigned an official rank within the harem hierarchy. It is unlikely she was immediately given a high title. New concubines, even those of special interest to the emperor, were often started at a lower rank to be elevated later, based on imperial favor or the birth of a son. She was assigned a specific residence, one of the many self-contained courtyard homes that made up the 6 western and 6 eastern palaces. A staff of eunuchs and palace maids was assigned to her. Their roles a mixture of servant, attendant, and warden. Every material aspect of her life, her food, her clothing, her allowance of charcoal in the winter, was now dictated by her official rank. Her past was irrelevant. Her new identity was a title and a position in a table of organization. The threshold had been crossed, and she had been fully absorbed into the machinery of the imperial household. The gates of her new home, a small palace within the larger palace, closed behind her, and for the first time, she was truly alone in the heart of her captivity. The woman who was absorbed into the administrative machinery of the Forbidden City was not, in any official capacity, the Fragrant Concubine. That name, Xiong Fei, is a product of legend, a poetic and dramatized appellation that emerged long after her death. To the meticulous scribes of the imperial household department, the eunuch officials who managed the emperor's domestic life, and the court itself, she was known by the formal titles conferred upon her by imperial decree. Stripped of folklore, reveals a different trajectory, one that is less dramatic, but far more illuminating of the actualities of court life. It is the story of the woman known as Consort Trong. According to the King archives, she entered the palace in the early months of 1760, roughly a year after the final suppression of the Koja rebellion. She was 20-6 years old, a relatively mature age for a new addition to the imperial harem, where many entrants were in their early teens. Her formal assimilation began with her designation as a Gui Ren, or noble lady. This was the 6th rank in the 8-tier hierarchy of imperial consorts. It was a respectable but not an exceptional position. It entitled her to a modest but comfortable household, a small retinue of servants, and a fixed annual stipend. Crucially, this initial placement contradicts the legendary narrative of an emperor, immediately and overwhelmingly besotted. Had Qianlong been driven by an uncontrollable obsession, he could have easily bypassed protocol and granted. Her entry as a noble lady suggests a more measured and conventional integration into the system. From this starting point, her career within the inner court followed a path of gradual, orderly promotion. 2 years after her arrival, in 1762, she was elevated one step to the 5th rank, that of a pin, or imperial concubine. It was at this time that she was granted the honorific name that would define her official identity, Rong. The character for Rong translates to countenance, appearance, or demeanor. It was a standard, auspicious title, often given to praise a consort's beauty or graceful bearing. It was not, notably, a reference to scent. She was now officially Rong Pin, Imperial Concubine Rong. Her final promotion came several years later, in 1768, when she was raised to the 4th rank, becoming Fei or Consort. She was now Rong Fei Consort Trong, a title she would hold for the rest of her life. This was a position of considerable status. It placed her in the upper echelons of the inner court, though still subordinate to the empress, imperial noble consorts, and noble consorts, Steady ascent over 8 years as characteristic of a consort who found favor with the emperor and conducted herself according to the rigorous expectations of the court. It does not reflect the tale of a defiant, rebellious captive who constantly resisted the emperor's advances. To rise through the ranks, one had to navigate the complex social and political environment of the inner court with skill, not with open opposition. Most significantly, the vast and detailed records of the King Court are completely silent on the central pillar of her legend, her scent. The archives of the Imperial Household Department were famously exhaustive, documenting daily menus, allocations of fabrics for clothing, medical consultations, and gift exchanges. In this mountain of administrative data, there is not a single verifiable mention of Consort Trong possessing any unusual or natural bodily fragrance. For an emperor as obsessed with cataloguing the unique and the curious as Qianlong was, such a remarkable human trait, had it existed, would almost certainly have been noted, commented upon, or even celebrated in an imperial poem. Its complete absence from the primary source material strongly suggests that the story of the scent is a later fabrication. The historical record, therefore, presents us with a woman who was a member of the defeated Kocha clan, who entered the Forbidden City as a political captive, and who, over the course of nearly 3 decades, lived a seemingly stable and successful life within the harem system, dying of natural causes in 1788 at the age of 50-4. This documented life of Consort Trong stands in stark opposition to the popular legend of Xiang Fei, the tragic heroine who lived in perpetual defiance and was ultimately foresighted. The discrepancy raises a fundamental question: why did the myth eclipse the reality? If the historical woman was a successful courtier, why was it necessary to invent a martyr? The answer lies not in the archives, but in the psychological needs that the story of the Gilded Cage was constructed to fulfill. Regardless of the historical timeline of her promotions from noble lady to consort, the legendary accounts preserve a consistent and psychologically potent element: the emperor's concerted effort to create a perfect environment for his new acquisition. The narrative of the Gilded Cage is not merely a metaphor, it describes a deliberate, lavish, and deeply strategic project of containment. The emperor, employing the full resources of the imperial state, set about constructing a prison so beautiful that its occupant might, he hoped, forget the existence of the world outside its walls. Her assigned residence was not a cell, but a finely appointed palace pavilion, a self-contained courtyard home. These were architectural masterpieces in their own right, constructed from the finest aromatic woods, like Nanmu, and adorned with intricate carvings and brightly painted eaves. Her windows would have looked out onto a private garden, meticulously designed with scholars' rocks, miniature streams, and carefully selected flora, creating a perfect, controlled landscape. It was a space of profound beauty and profound isolation, a world in miniature where every element was curated for her experience. Into this space, a constant stream of material lavishness was directed from the workshops and storehouses of the imperial household department. The legend details this with particular relish, and it aligns perfectly with Qianlong's known character. He bestowed upon her robes not of ordinary silk, but of the rarest brocades from Suzhou and Nanjing, fabrics so rich with gold and silver thread that they were reserved for the highest echelons of the court. These garments were oft untailored in the style of her homeland, a departure from the strict Manchu dress code enforced within the Forbidden City. This was not an act of cultural respect, it was a calculated tactic. By allowing her to retain the outward symbols of her identity, he sought to soften the reality of her captivity, framing it as a comfortable relocation rather than a cultural erasure. It acknowledged her otherness, while simultaneously domesticating it. The imperial kitchens, capable of producing thousands of meals a day, were tasked with recreating the specific cuisine of Altisha for her. This was an immense logistical challenge. Exotic ingredients, the sweet honey melons, the grapes of Turpin, the specific spices for roasted lamb were transported thousands of miles, via the imperial relay system to her table in Beijing. Flatbreads were baked in specially constructed ovens. This culinary effort was a powerful form of psychological manipulation. It was an exercise in environmental pacification, an attempt to replicate the sensory inputs of a lost world, to soothe her nostalgia and blunt the sharp edges of her displacement. Every meal was a reminder of both what she had lost and the emperor's seemingly limitless power to restore a facsimile of it. Jewelry and precious objects were showered upon her. White jade from Khotan, the very region of her birth, was carved into intricate pendants and hairpins. Pearls from the southern seas and kingfisher feathers of an iridescent blue were fashioned into elaborate headdresses. These were not simply gifts, they were adornments. They were the emperor's way of enhancing his prized possession, of adding his own layer of imperial value to her natural state. In his collector's mind, he was not merely giving her beautiful things, he was completing her, framing her exotic beauty within the context of king imperial taste. The emperor's own visits were the central events around which her life now revolved. These were not spontaneous romantic encounters. An emperor's movements within the inner court were highly ritualized, announced in advance and accompanied by a retinue of eunuchs. His arrival in her pavilion was the arrival of the ultimate authority. His attention was a form of high-stakes pressure. Favor from the emperor brought status, better living conditions, and the envy of other women in the court. Disfavor could lead to neglect, humiliation, and a life of quiet despair. The legendary accounts of her defiance in his presence, of her coldness and silence, refusing to show pleasure or gratitude for the gilded cage, was the only form of power she retained. It was a passive but profound rebellion, a denial of his narrative that her captivity was a desirable fate. Every gift she left untouched, every delicacy she refused, was a small victory in a battle of wills that he, with all his absolute power, could not seem to win. The gilded cage was constructed, but its occupant refused to sing. The emperor's initial strategy of pacification through material luxury had yielded unsatisfactory results. The silks, the jades, and the exotic foods had failed to penetrate the captive's profound melancholia. Her persistent sadness was a flaw in the masterpiece he sought to possess. A perfect collectible must not, by its own volition, express imperfection. For a man of Qianlong's temperament, this was not a romantic setback but a technical problem requiring a more ambitious solution. If bringing pieces of her homeland to her was insufficient, he would construct a facsimile of the homeland itself. He therefore embarked upon a project of unprecedented architectural and theatrical scope, an act of psychological engineering on a scale only an emperor could contemplate. South of the Forbidden City, adjacent to the western wall of the palace complex, lay a series of interconnected lakes and gardens that served as the emperor's private pleasure grounds. In this area, known as the Nunhai or Southern Sea, he commanded the construction of a unique set of buildings. The centerpiece was the Baoyu Lu, or Treasure Moon Tower. This was not a Chinese miners-style pagoda or pavilion. Its architecture was a deliberate and painstaking imitation of the Islamic style of Alt-e-Shah. It featured arched windows, domed roofs, and a facade decorated with brightly colored, glazed tiles, creating an aesthetic that was utterly alien to the restrained, symmetrical world of Imperial Beijing. The tower was strategically placed so that it would be directly visible from the windows of the pavilion where the emperor had housed his captive concubine, offering her a constant and unavoidable view of this architectural echo of her past. This was not merely an architectural folly. It was the backdrop for a far more elaborate and surreal production. Below the tower, a Muslim market street was built. This was a fully realized, but completely artificial bazaar. Stalls were erected and stocked with goods and produce native to her homeland. Textiles, carpets, fruits, imported at great expense, filled the marketplace. To populate this staff of the inner court, eunuchs and palace maids were ordered to shed their silk court robes and don the costumes of Uyghur merchants, artisans, and townspeople. On the emperor's command, they would enact the daily life of a Kashgarian market for her sole benefit. They would haggle over prices, call out their wares, and engage in pantomime conversations, creating a bustling, vibrant tableau of a life that no longer existed for her. The most audacious element of this grand illusion, according to the legend, was the inclusion of a building that resembled a mosque. Whether this was a functional place of worship is highly doubtful and politically improbable. More likely, it was an architectural shell, a facade complete with a minaret, designed to complete the visual verisimilitude of the scene. From her window, she could now look out and see not the yellow-tiled roofs of the Forbidden City, but a street scene from her home, anchored by the familiar silhouette of a place of prayer. The psychological intent behind this immense undertaking was complex and deeply manipulative. On one level, it was the ultimate gesture of appeasement, an attempt to soothe her homesickness by immersing her in a total environment of familiarity. It was a declaration of the emperor's power, demonstrating that his resources were so vast, he could not only conquer her world, but also replicate it at will. But on a deeper level, it was a strategy of substitution, painful memories of her real home with this new, controlled, and safe version. The artificial bazaar was lively and peaceful, the real one was now under military occupation. The replica was a perfect, sanitized diorama, free from the trauma and loss associated with the original. By providing this substitute, he sought to sever her emotional connection to her past and root her identity within the world. he had created for her. The entire production was a testament to his collector's mentality. He was not just providing comfort, he was creating a custom built display case for his most prized possession. Like a biologist constructing a perfect terrarium for a rare butterfly, he engineered an entire ecosystem designed to make his specimen feel at home, and therefore behave in a more pleasingly docile manner. Yet, the project was a catastrophic psychological failure. The sight of this elaborate forgery did not soothe her, it amplified her sense of loss. The eunuchs in costume were not her people, they were a grotesque parody. The market was not a community, it was a silent, cruel play. The hollow mosque on the horizon was not a source of spiritual comfort, but a monument to her profound spiritual isolation. The emperor, in his quest to build a perfect cage, had succeeded only in building a more perfect mirror for her despair. The failure of the grand architectural and theatrical pacification project marked a significant turning point in the psychological dynamic between the emperor and his captive. His most elaborate and expensive attempt to engineer her contentment had not only failed to produce the desired effect, but had actively deepened her melancholia. Faced with this impasse, the emperor's strategy of lavish appeasement began to fray, and the narrative of the fragrant concubine shifts from one of passive sadness to one of active, albeit subtle, defiance. The legend of her resistance is built upon a series of powerful and enduring motifs that portray her not as a fragile victim, but as an unyielding combatant in a war of wills. Her primary weapon was the unwavering performance of her own grief. In a court where emotional display was highly regulated and a cheerful demeanor was a professional requirement for a consort, her persistent sorrow was a radical act. She refused to be happy. She met the emperor's visits with a profound and impenetrable silence, her eyes reportedly fixed on a distant point, as if looking through him and the ornate walls of her pavilion toward the lost deserts of her home. This was not the histrionic grief of a court drama, it was a quiet, constant, and corrosive presence. For Qianlong, a man accustomed to universal obedience and adulation, this was a deeply unsettling experience. Her sadness was a constant, silent rebuke, a refutation of the value of everything he had given her. It was a flaw in his collection that he could not polish away, a living testament to the fact that his power, while absolute, was not total. He could command her body, but he could not command her spirit. This psychological resistance was augmented by symbolic acts. One of the most potent stories concerns her clothing. While the emperor had provided her with garments in her native Yugur style, she reportedly repurposed this gesture of appeasement into a statement of protest. She chose to wear only simple, unadorned robes of white or somber colors. In the context of her own culture, and indeed in Chinese culture as well, white is the color of mourning. Her every appearance was therefore a funeral observance. She was in mourning for her husband, for her people, and for her own lost life. The emperor had intended the clothes to be a comforting reminder of home. She transformed them into a constant, visual accusation. He had sought to domesticate her otherness, but she insisted on performing it as an emblem of her subjugation. The ultimate and most famous symbol of her defiance, however, was the concealed dagger. According to the legend, she kept a small, sharp blade hidden at all times within the flowing sleeves of her robes. She made no secret of its presence. When the emperor approached her, she would reportedly let him know, through a gesture or a quiet word to a translator, that the weapon was with her. The purpose of this dagger was not assassination. An attack on the son of Heaven surrounded by his bodyguards was an impossibility, and she was not a fool. The blade was for herself. It was a physical manifestation of her final and absolute veto. It was a declaration that she would take her own life before allowing him to consummate his possession of her. This single object fundamentally altered the power dynamic. It transformed the emperor's visits from the routine inspection of a treasured object into a tense and unpredictable confrontation. The prize in his collection had revealed its own self-destruct mechanism. He could force himself upon her, but he would be left with a corpse, the ultimate and most grotesque failure of a collector. The dagger was the physical guarantee of her spiritual inviolability. It was a constant reminder that while he controlled the gilded cage, she, and she alone, controlled the fate of its occupant. It was the ultimate assertion of agency in a situation of absolute powerlessness. The emperor could conquer armies and erase nations, but he could not disarm a woman of her will to die. This, in the architecture of the legend, was her victory. She could not escape his prison, but she had successfully defined its final, unbreakable boundary. The introduction of the dagger into the narrative, whether historical fact or symbolic invention, represents the failure of the emperor's initial methodologies of control. The architectural replication of a homeland and the constant provision of material luxury had been designed to pacify, to create a dependency and contentment that would render the captive docile. Her ultimate rejection of these overtures, crystallized in her readiness for self-annihilation, presented a conceptual problem for the emperor. His prize was threatening to destroy itself. This forced a evaluation, not of his desire, but of the very nature of his actions. To understand the dynamic that followed, it is necessary to deconstruct the imperial gestures and classify them, not as acts of affection, but as a sustained campaign of possession. In the imperial paradigm, the concept of love as a reciprocal and empathetic bond between two individuals was largely irrelevant. The emperor's relationship with the women of his court was, by its very nature, an expression of power and proprietorship. His favor was a resource to be distributed, and his attention was a validation of a woman's status and value within the system. Qianlong's fixation on the captive from Alti-Sha can be interpreted as an extreme manifestation of his collector's impulse, with his actions mirroring the way a connoisseur treats a priceless artifact, rather than how a man treats a woman. His gaze upon her was not that of a lover, but of an appraiser. He appreciated her for her unique qualities, her exotic origin, her reputed fragrance, her reputes to be observed and admired, much like the perfect glaze on a Song Dynasty bowl or the elegant brushwork of a Yuan Dynasty painting. The object's own intuitivity, its feelings, its history, its trauma was an inconvenient footnote. The goal was not to understand the source of her sorrow, but to eliminate it, as one would repair a crack in a piece of jade to restore its aesthetic perfection. His attempts to make her happy were not rooted in empathy, but in a desire to improve the quality and performance of his acquisition. The grand projects, such as the construction of the treasure moon tower and the mock bazaar, were not romantic gestures. They were acts of advanced curatorship. An expert collector knows that a delicate object requires a specific environment to prevent its degradation. The rare manuscript requires a climate-controlled room. A fragile textile must be kept from the light. In this context, the emperor's recreation of her homeland was an attempt to build the perfect psychological and sensory victory. He believed that by controlling her environment and surrounding her with the proper stimuli, he could preserve her in a more desirable state. It was an exercise in human husbandry, a project to manage the specimen by perfectly managing its habitat. The failure of this project did not prove the strength of her love for another, but the impossibility of fabricating an authentic soul. Consequently, all the gifts, the silks, the foods, the jewels must be recontextualized as instruments of possession. In the court, gifts were never free, they were transactions that created obligation. By showering her with luxury, the emperor was attempting to enmesh her in a web of debt, to make her continued existence so materially dependent on his favor that resistance would become unthinkable. But she refused the terms of the transaction. Either overtly or through her melancholic indifference, she was refusing to acknowledge the debt. This rendered his generosity impotent, exposing it as a mere tactic. It was the equivalent of a rare bird in a golden cage refusing to eat the delicacies offered by its captor. The act of refusal, however small, was an assertion that she did not belong to the cage. No matter how opulent its construction, the affection he displayed was therefore a form of coercive pressure, a disguise for the brute fact that she was his property. Her defiance, symbolized by the dagger, was her persistent, unwavering refusal to ratify the terms of her ownership. Her unwavering resistance, symbolized by the dagger and the performance of mourning, created an inviolable space around her. But this defense mechanism came at a staggering psychological cost, for the wall she built to keep the emperor out also locked her into a state of absolute and profound isolation. The gilded cage was not merely a physical location, it was an existential condition, and its primary material was loneliness. Her solitude was not a simple lack of companionship, it was a comprehensive cultural, linguistic, and spiritual quarantine. The most immediate and insurmountable barrier was language. The king court was a polyglot environment, but its dominant tongues were Manchu, the language of the ruling elite, and the various dialects of Chinese spoken by the bureaucracy and the majority of the palace staff. The captive from Alti Shah spoke a Turkic language, what would today be called Uyghur. To her, the constant hum of the forbidden city, the whispered gossip of the eunuchs, the formal announcements of court protocol, a lyrical cadence of recited poetry, the shouted commands of the palace guard was not communication. It was undifferentiated sound, a wall of noise that confirmed her status as a perpetual alien. She was in a state of semiotic exile, unable to form the most basic human connections, to share a simple observation, to ask a question, or to understand the nuanced social currents that governed her survival. Any communication with the emperor or her senior attendants would have been filtered through an interpreter, a process that strips language of all intimacy and turns conversation into a formal, sterile transaction. Beyond language lay a deeper cultural chasm. She was a product of the Islamic civilization of Central Asia, a world with its own distinct cosmology, ethics, and social norms. The Forbidden City, by contrast, was the apex of the Chinese Confucian world order. Her daily spiritual life, which would have been structured around the 5 daily prayers of Islam, had no place in a system that revolved around the veneration of ancestors, the observation of the Son of Heaven's rituals, and a syncretic blend of Buddhist and Taoist court practices. The mock mosque built within her sight was not a comfort, it was a sacrilegious parody, a constant reminder of the spiritual void she now inhabited. The very concepts that structured society, the role of women, the nature of family, the relationship between the individual and the state were fundamentally different. She was a Muslim noblewoman from a clan-based society thrust into the heart of a bureaucratic, polygamous imperial household whose sole purpose was to serve the dynastic interests of a single man. This cultural isolation was reinforced by the social ecosystem of the inner court. The thousands of women in the harem were not a community of sisters, they were a complex hierarchy of rivals, all competing for the ultimate prize, the emperor's attention and favor. The woman known as Consort Trong, as a recipient of the emperor's intense and unusual fixation, would not have been a candidate for friendship. To the other consorts she was a threat, an exotic anomaly who had disrupted the established order. Her special treatment, her unique diet, and her private audiences with the emperor would have been sources of immense jealousy and suspicion. She would have been the subject of constant, whispered speculation, but she would never have been privy to it. She was an object of intense scrutiny, but she was entirely excluded from the society that scrutinized her. Even her immediate attendants, the eunuchs and palace maids assigned to her household, were not companions. They were employees of the state, their first loyalty owed to the imperial household department and, ultimately, to the emperor. Their kindness was professional, their attentiveness a function of their duty. They were her servants, but they were also her wardens, their presence a constant form of surveillance. Any confidence she might have shared, any moment of weakness she might have displayed, was liable to be recorded and reported up the chain of command. She was surrounded by people from the moment she woke to the moment she slept, yet she was entirely, terrifyingly alone. This profound loneliness must be understood as an active instrument of her captivity, not an accidental byproduct. It stripped her of all external support, forcing her to rely on her own internal resources. The emperor, in isolating her, may have believed he was making her more dependent on him, the sole source of human contact in her life. But instead, it forged within her a diamond minus hard self minus reliance. Having lost everything, her home, her family, her community, her language, the only territory she had left to defend was her own mind, her own memories, her own grief. Her solitude became her fortress, and from within its silent walls, she waged her quiet, unwinnable, and unending war. At the very heart of this entire historical drama, pulsating like a central, irrefutable fact, is the motif of the scent. We have established that its existence is unverifiable in the archival record, suggesting it is a later embellishment. But to dismiss it as a mere fiction is to miss the point entirely. The scent, whether real or imagined, is the conceptual key to the entire legend. It is the primary vehicle through which the story's themes of objectification, power, and resistance are articulated. It is the perfect poetic engine for a narrative of psychological possession, and its symbolic weight far exceeds any question of its literal reality. First and foremost, the attribution of a natural, uncontrollable fragrance is the ultimate act of objectification. It reduces a complex human being to a single, passive sensory attribute. A person's worth is typically located in their character, their intellect, their actions, or their lineage. By making scent her defining characteristic, the legend displaces all these other markers of identity. She is valuable not for who she is, but for what she emits. Her fragrance is an involuntary effluent, a biological process entirely outside of her control. It transforms her from a subject with agency into an object to be experienced. The Emperor's fixation, therefore, is not directed at a person, but a phenomenon. He is not a suitor attempting to win a woman's heart. He is a connoisseur seeking to acquire a source of rare perfume. She becomes, in this framing, a living censer, a human vessel for an exquisite aroma. This olfactory framing makes her the perfect collectible. Unlike beauty, which fades, or talent, which can be withheld, the scent is portrayed as a constant and intrinsic quality. It is her unchangeable essence, the very thing that makes her unique. For a collector like Qianlong, who sought the rarest and most singular of objects, this was the ultimate prize. It was a biological masterpiece, a work of art produced by nature itself, and therefore infinitely more valuable than any man-made artifact. His desire to possess her becomes the desire to control the source of this phenomenon, to own the inalienable. The scent functions as her ontological label, the defining entry in the Emperor's mental catalogue of his possessions. Furthermore, the scent is the indelible mark of her otherness. It is the biological proof that she does not belong. Clothing could be changed, language could be learned, customs could be adopted, but a natural bodily fragrance was an unminus assimilable trait. It permanently marked her as foreign, exotic, and separate from the homogeneous world of the Manchu court. This otherness was the source of her value to the Emperor, but it was also the justification for her special confinement. Because she was fundamentally different, she could be treated differently, placed outside the normal rules and protocols of the harem. The scent explained and rationalized her gilded cage. She was not a political prisoner in the conventional sense, nor a consort seeking advancement. She was a unique specimen that required a unique and controlled habitat. Finally, within the logic of the legend, the scent becomes a metaphor for her spirit or soul. It is the intangible, incorporeal part of her being. The Emperor could imprison her body in a pavilion, but he could not capture her fragrance. It filled the air, a constant, ambient reminder of her presence and, by extension, her defiance. His inability to make her happy, to break her will, is mirrored in his inability to truly possess her scent. He could stand in the room and experience it, but he could not hold it in his hands or lock it in a box. It remained ephemeral, free, and ultimately her own. Her resistance, symbolized by the dagger, was the active defense of this inner essence. She was willing to destroy the vessel, her body, to prevent the Emperor from claiming ownership over it. The battle was not over her physical person, but over this fragrant, metaphorical soul. The scent, therefore, elevates the narrative from a simple story of a captive to a fable about the indestructibility of the human spirit in the face of absolute power. The Forbidden City was an organism with a highly developed nervous system. Its censors were the thousands of eunuchs, maids, and officials who observed every event, however minor, and transmitted that information through the palace's formal and informal networks. An emperor's actions, and especially his obsessions, were never a private affair. They were seismic events that sent tremors through the entire political and social structure of the court. Qianlong's fixation on the captive from Alti Shah, initially a matter of personal curiosity and acquisition, had over time become a noticeableizing anomaly that generated friction at every level of the imperial hierarchy. The first to register this friction were the eunuchs of the imperial household department. These were not mere servants, they were the professional administrators of the emperor's life, and their world was governed by budgets, precedent, and protocol. From their perspective, the emperor's project was a logistical nightmare. The constant demand for rare foods from a distant province strained the imperial supply chain. The construction of special buildings required the diversion of funds and craftsmen from other projects. The commissioning of non-miners' standard clothing disrupted the orderly output of the imperial silk workshops. These were procedural deviations, exceptions to a system designed for uniformity and predictability. On their ledgers and in their daily reports, the concubine represented a recurring and costly irregularity. More importantly, the senior eunuchs were the custodians of the inner court's equilibrium. They had managed the complex ecosystem of the harem for decades, balancing the ambitions of rival consorts and ensuring the smooth operation of the imperial household. The emperor's intense focus on a single woman, and a foreign one at that, upset this delicate balance. It violated the unwritten rule that imperial favor, while not distributed equally, should at least acknowledge the established hierarchy. His lavish gifts and frequent visits to her pavilion created widespread jealousy and resentment among the other, higher-ranking consorts, including the empress herself. The eunuchs would have been tasked with managing the resulting tensions, mediating disputes, and placating the neglected. For these administrators, the emperor's obsession was not a romance, it was a source of systemic instability. This bureaucratic concern was mirrored by a more profound political anxiety among the high officials of the outer court. The members of the Grand Council, the emperor's innermost cabinet of Manchu and Han advisors, viewed the situation through the cold lens of political security and historical precedent. Chinese history was replete with cautionary tales of emperors whose infatuation with a beautiful consort had led to distraction, corruption, and the eventual downfall of a dynasty. Figures like Yang Guifei of the Tang dynasty were specters that haunted the consciousness of the Confucian scholar-official. They saw a ruler spending an inordinate amount of time, energy, and resources on state matter, and they grew concerned. The captives for Norigem was a specific and potent source of this anxiety. She was not a Manchu noblewoman with family ties to the imperial clan, nor a Han lady from a reputable official family. She was a Uyghur, a member of a recently and violently conquered people. In the minds of the court's political elite, this made her an inherently suspect figure. They would not have seen her as an individual, but as the representative of a potentially seditious foreign influence. Her very presence so close to the emperor was a security risk. Her legendary defiance and melancholia would not have been interpreted as personal grief, but as a sign of intractable enmity, a quiet, festering rebellion at the very heart of the palace. They feared she could bewitch the emperor, subtly influencing his decisions or, at the very least, distracting him from the proper governance of the realm. Within the inner court itself, the reaction was more personal but no less political. The harem was a competitive environment where status, resources, and one's future security depended entirely on the emperor's favor. The arrival of the fragrant concubine, and the emperor's obsessive attention to her, was a direct threat to every other woman in the palace. Her rapid, if informal, rise in prominence disrupted the established pecking order, who had spent years carefully cultivating their positions, now saw their influence wane. This would have bred an atmosphere of intense intrigue. Factions would have formed, united in their opposition to the foreign newcomer. Whispers would have turned into accusations. Rumors about her that she was a sorceress, a spy, that her scent was an unnatural form of magic would have circulated through the corridors of the inner court, poisoning the wells of opinion against her. The story of her concealed dagger, if true, would have been amplified and broadcast as proof of her treacherous and murderous intent. These streams of concern, the administrative chaos, the political anxiety, and the social jealousy began to flow together, creating a unified current of opinion that the emperor's fixation had become a problem for the state was, by definition, a problem for the one figure in the Forbidden City, whose authority was not derived from the emperor, but stood alongside it his mother, the Empress Dowager. In the rigidly hierarchical cosmos of the Forbidden City, there was only one individual whose authority approached that of the emperor himself, his mother, the Empress Dowager. In the case of the Qianlong Emperor, this was the Empress Dowager Chongqing, the biological mother of Hongli and the widow of the preceding Yongzheng Emperor. She was not merely a sentimental figurehead or a retired matriarch. She was the anchor of the imperial family's legitimacy, a living symbol of dynastic continuity, a living symbol of dynastic continuity, by the deeply ingrained principles of Confucian filial piety, an object of the emperor's absolute reverence and obedience. Her perspective on the emperor's obsession with the foreign captive was not that of a jealous rival or a concerned bureaucrat, it was the perspective of the ultimate guardian of the dynasty's stability and integrity. By the time the woman from Alti-Shah entered the palace in 1760, the Empress Dowager was in her late 60s, a formidable and highly respected figure who had presided over the inner court for decades. She had witnessed the succession of 3 emperors and understood, with an intimacy that few could match, the delicate interplay of personal desire and political necessity that defined an emperor's life. Her primary role, as she would have seen it, was to ensure the long-term health and security of the imperial lineage and the Manchu ruling house. All other considerations, including her son's personal happiness, were secondary to this paramount duty. Her sources of information would have been unparalleled. The network of senior eunuchs, long-serving palace maids, and the consorts themselves formed a web of intelligence that reported directly to her. She would have been aware of the emperor's fixation long before it became a subject of open concern in the outer court. She would have known about the special dietary arrangements, the construction of the Treasure Moon Tower, the rumors of the captive's unyielding melancholia, and most alarmingly, the story of the concealed dagger. She would have processed this information not as a romantic drama, but as a series of political and security threats. From her vantage point, the captive represented a multifaceted danger. First, she was a distraction. The emperor was the chief executive of a vast and complex empire. His time and energy were the state's most precious resources. The Empress Dowager would have seen his inordinate attention to a single concubine as a dereliction of his imperial duties, a diversion of his focus from the vital work of governance. This was not a moral judgment, but a pragmatic one. An emperor-absorbed obsession was an emperor who was not fully attending to matters of state, and that created a vulnerability for the entire dynasty. Second, the captive was a source of internal discord. The Empress Dowager was the ultimate manager of the imperial harem. She knew that a stable inner court was essential for a stable imperial succession. By disrupting the established hierarchy and fomenting jealousy among the other consorts, the emperor's favoritism was sowing chaos in her domain. This was not a matter of petty squabbles, it was a threat to the orderly production of heirs and the careful management of the political alliances that the imperial marriages represented. The foreign woman was a rogue element, an unsanctioned variable in a carefully controlled equation. Finally, and most critically, the Empress Dowager would have viewed the captive through the lens of Manchu identity and ethnic purity. The Qing dynasty was ruled by a Manchu elite governing a vast Han Chinese majority under mosaic of other ethnic groups. The preservation of a distinct Manchu identity through the adherence to Manchu customs, language, and traditions was a cornerstone of their ruling ideology. The emperor's apparent infatuation with a non-Manchu, non-Han woman from a newly conquered territory was a threat to this core principle. It signaled a potential dilution of the imperial bloodline and a dangerous blurring of the line between the conquerors and the conquered. In her eyes, the woman was not just a foreign individual, she was the embodiment of a foreign influence, a potentially corrupting force that had penetrated the very heart of the imperial family. The dagger was not just a threat to the emperor's physical safety, it was a symbol of an untamable, alien spirit that had no place in the ordered world of the Forbidden City. Her motivations were not born of personal animosity, but of a cold, clear, and unwavering political calculus. The foreign captive, in her assessment, had become a liability could no longer afford. The Empress Dowager's concerns transcended the immediate issues of courtly discord and administrative disruption. Her gaze was fixed upon a more distant and far more critical horizon, the future of the dynasty itself. In any hereditary monarchy, the single most important process is the orderly and undisputed succession of power. It is the bedrock upon which the entire edifice of the state is built. Any threat to the clarity and integrity of the succession is, by definition, an existential threat. From the perspective of the Manchu elite, and most acutely from that of the Empress Dowager, the foreign woman from Alti-Shah was now perceived as precisely such a threat, not through overt action, but through the insidious potential of her influence. The most catastrophic, if statistically unlikely, scenario was the possibility that she might bear the emperor's son. Had this occurred, it would have precipitated a dynastic crisis of the first order. An imperial prince with a Yuga mother, the widow of a recently executed rebel leader, would have been a constitutional anomaly. The king's succession was, in theory, not strictly based on primogeniture. The reigning emperor selected his most capable son. However, the maternal lineage of a candidate was of immense political importance. A prince's power base was inextricably linked to his mother's family and their network of alliances at court. A half-Yuga prince's maternal kin were the defeated and subjugated clans of a restive frontier territory. He would have no natural allies within the Manchu aristocracy, making him an isolated and vulnerable figure. Conversely, and perhaps more dangerously, his very existence could have made him a symbol and a potential rallying point for dissent in the newly conquered Western territories. His mixed heritage would have been a permanent and visible reminder of the conquest, a contamination of the sacred imperial bloodline. The Manchu princes and nobles, who viewed themselves as a warrior caste entitled to rule, would have seen such a child as an unacceptable aberration. The emperor's potential favor for such a son would have been interpreted not as parental affection, but as a betrayal of his own people. The birth of this child would have introduced a permanent element of instability and factionalism into the very heart of the imperial clan, a problem that could plague the dynasty for generations. Even if she remained childless, her influence over the emperor was a potent political tool that could be exploited to disrupt the existing succession landscape. The Qianlong Emperor already had numerous sons by his empress and other high-ranking Manchu consorts. These princes and their mothers were locked in a subtle, long-term competition for imperial favor. In this high-stakes environment, the foreign concubine became a wild card. Her unique and seemingly unshakable hold on the emperor's attention made her a potential kingmaker. A prince who managed to win her favor, or whose mother forged an alliance with her, might gain a crucial advantage by having her whisper his name to the emperor at an opportune moment. This created an incentive for the existing imperial sons to engage in dangerous political maneuvering, attempting to court the favor of a woman whom the establishment viewed as an enemy of the state. It threatened to turn the process of succession from a carefully managed selection into a chaotic free-for-all, driven by the whims of a foreign captive. To the court's old guard, this influence was inexplicable in conventional terms. The emperor was a mature and famous astute ruler, not a foolish youth. That he could be so thoroughly captivated by this one woman, to the point of neglecting protocol and alarming his advisors, suggested that something more than mere infatuation was at play. This is where the legend of the scent provided a sinister explanation. Her power was not political or intellectual, it was preternatural. Her fragrance was reinterpreted as a form of magic, a subtle and constant enchantment that clouded the emperor's judgment and bent his will to her own. She was not merely a distraction, she was a sorceress who had bewitched the Son of Heaven, subverting the natural order in which the ruler's mind must be clear, rational, and devoted solely to the welfare of the state. This supernatural framing elevated her from a political problem to a cosmic one, making her elimination a matter of restoring the proper balance of the universe. For the Empress Dowager, the evidence was clear. The foreign woman was no longer a personal indulgence of her son. She was a cancer on the body politic, and her continued presence threatened the very mechanism that ensured the dynasty's survival. The convergence of these streams of anxiety, bureaucratic, politic, created a formidable consensus within the Forbidden City. The emperor's obsession was no longer a private matter to be managed, it was a public crisis to be resolved. The agent of this resolution, by necessity and by right, was the Empress Dowager. Having consolidated the concerns of the court and filtered them, through her own unwavering commitment to dynastic security, she transitioned from a state of passive observation to one of active intervention. This set the stage for the central, pivotal conflict of the entire legend, the collision of the emperor's absolute personal will with the even more absolute demands of filial piety. The foundational ethic of the Confucian state was Xiao, or filial piety. It was not simply a domestic virtue, it was the model for all political relationships, the principle that bound the empire together. The emperor, as the son of heaven, was expected to be the ultimate exemplar of this virtue. His obedience to his mother was a public performance that affirmed the moral basis of his rule. To openly defy her would not be a mere family dispute, it would be a shocking breach of cosmic and political order, an act that would undermine the very ideology that legitimized his throne. The Qianlong Emperor, a ruler whose every whim was lawful millions, was, in this once pacific relationship, bound by a power greater than his own. According to the legendary account, the Empress Dowager chose her moment with strategic precision. She summoned her son, the Emperor, to her residence, the Palace of Longevity and Health. This choice of venue was significant. By forcing him to come to her, she was reinforcing the proper hierarchy of their relationship. In this space, he was not the sovereign, he was the son. The confrontation that ensued was not an emotional argument but a political hearing. Speaking with the full weight of her authority as the matriarch of the imperial clan, laid out her case. Her arguments would have been framed not in terms of personal dislike, but in the cold, unassailable language of dynastic security. She would have cited the disruption the foreign woman had caused within the inner court, the dangerous precedent of her influence, the whispers of witchcraft that were now circulating, and most damningly, the potential threat she posed to the purity of the imperial bloodline and the stability of the succession. She would have presented the woman not as a person, but as a political liability, a cancerous growth that had to be excised for the health of the state. She was not asking, she was issuing a diagnosis and prescribing the only cure. The woman had to be eliminated. The emperor, for the first time in his adult life, found himself in a position of utter impotence. Every argument he could muster was rooted in personal desire, while his mother's arguments were rooted in public duty. He could speak of his affection or her harmlessness, but these were the weak protestations of an individual against the immense, impersonal logic of the state. To the Empress Dowager's claim that the woman threatened the dynasty, he had no adequate response. To defend her was to implicitly place his personal feelings above the well-minus being of the empire, a position that was morally and politically indefensible for a Confucian monarch. The standoff was absolute. His imperial authority, which could command armies and move mountains, had met the one boundary it could not cross: his filial duty. He could not consent to her death, but he could not forbid his mother from acting. The legend resolves this impasse with a detail of tragic irony. A crucial state ritual, the annual winter solstice ceremony at the Temple of Heaven, required the emperor's presence. This was one of the most sacred duties of the Son of Heaven, a solemn rite in which he communicated with the celestial powers on behalf of all his subjects. It was an obligation he could not delegate or postpone. His impending departure from the Forbidden City for this ritual created the political vacuum needed. In his absence, her authority within the palace would be supreme. The emperor understood this perfectly. He was being forced to choose between two fundamental duties: his duty to the state's cosmic order, represented by the ritual, and his duty to protect the object of his obsession. By choosing the former, as he must, he was effectively abandoning the latter to her fate. He was trapped by the very principles that gave him his power. He pleaded, he argued, but in the end he was defeated. He made his preparations for the ceremony at the Temple of Heaven, knowing that when he returned, the living artifact he had so desperately sought to possess would be gone. The moment the emperor's ceremonial procession cleared the gate of heavenly purity, a profound and immediate shift occurred in the political atmosphere of the inner court. His absence was not merely a physical vacancy, it was a temporary suspension of his will, a ceding of supreme operational authority to the only person who could wield it in his stead. The Empress Dowager did not hesitate. The emperor's departure was the signal, the precise alignment of opportunity and necessity for which she had been waiting. Her response was not one of passionate haste, but of cold, calculated, and efficient action. A small, senior delegation of eunuchs was dispatched from the Palace of Longevity and Health. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the inner court, not with the urgency of assassins, but with the quiet, deliberate pace of officials carrying out an negotiable administrative directive. Their arrival at the pavilion of the foreign concubine was not a violent intrusion. It was a formal summons. The doors were open, and the chief eunuch would have simply announced that her presence was required by the Empress Dowager. There would have been no explanation given and none expected. For the captive, this summons coming at the precise moment of the Emperor's ritual absence would have been an unambiguous death sentence. Her long standoff was over. She was escorted from her gilded cage, likely for the last time. As she walked through the gardens and courtyards, the ordinary life of the palace would have continued around her, a surreal contrast to the finality of her journey. She was brought not to an execution ground or a dungeon, but to a formal reception hall within the Empress Dowager's palace. The setting was one of austere, traditional grandeur, a room designed to project the unimpeachable authority of the Manchu matriarch. The Empress Dowager was seated, flanked by her highest ranking ladies in waiting, her expression impassive. She was not a judge presiding over a trial, she was an executive ratifying a decision that had already been made. The legendary accounts of this final confrontation emphasized the concubine's complete lack of fear or surprise. She had, in a sense, been preparing for this moment since her arrival. She did not plead for her life, nor did she protest her innocence. She simply stood before the woman who held her fate, a silent and solitary figure of defiance to the very end. The Empress Dowager, in turn, did not engage in a lengthy tirade. She pronounced the verdict with the dispassionate clarity of a physician explaining the necessary amputation. The captive was a foreign influence that had clouded the emperor's mind, a source of disorder within the court, and a threat to the stability of the dynasty. Her continued existence was a political liability that could no longer be tolerated. The decision was not personal, it was a matter of state. With the pronouncement made, a eunuch stepped forward bearing a black lacquer tray. Upon it, according to the most common version of the legend, lay a length of white silk cord. In the grim lexicon of imperial justice, this was the offer of a dignified death. It was not the brutal execution of a common criminal, but an invitation for a high-status individual to take their own life, preserving a final shred of honor and sparing the court the indelicacy of a public spectacle. The choice presented to her was, of course, no choice at all. Had she refused, the eunuchs in attendance would have carried out the sentence themselves. Her acceptance of the silk cord was her final, and perhaps her greatest, act of agency. It was the ultimate fulfillment of the promise she had made with her concealed dagger. She had always maintained that she alone would control the moment and manner of her death, and in this, the Empress Dowager was now her unwitting accomplice. She took the cord, and in the silent, watchful presence of the Empress Dowager and her court, she was compelled to end her own life, ensuring it was completed swiftly and without complication. The process was sterile, efficient, and final. The foreign fragrance that had supposedly haunted the Forbidden City was extinguished. The source of the Emperor's distraction was removed. The political liability was neutralized. The accounts were balanced. Order in the cold and unforgiving calculus of the imperial court had been restored. The rituals at the Temple of Heaven were a profound exercise in cosmic affirmation. The Emperor, as the sole intermediary between the human and celestial realms, had performed his sacred duties with meticulous precision. The sacrifices were made, the prayers were offered, and the mandate of heaven was, for another year, secured. As his procession entered the Forbidden City, moving along the imperial way toward the inner court, he was the living embodiment of order, stability, and absolute power. But this carefully maintained cosmic balance was about to collide with a catastrophic personal disorder. According to the legend, the Emperor did not proceed to his own quarters or to the offices of the Grand Council upon his return. His first and only destination was the pavilion of his captive. It was a deviation from protocol that signaled his deep preoccupation. The journey through the palace corridors, which he had made so many times in anticipation, was now charged with a sense of dread. The silence that greeted him at her courtyard was the first sign. It was not the tranquil quiet of a well-orbed household, but a dead, hollow silence, a vacuum where the normal sounds of attendance and life should have been. The air, which the legend insists was always perfumed with her presence, was now neutral, empty. The news was delivered by a trembling, prostrate eunuch. The words were likely formulaic, stripped of all detail, reporting only the essential fact by the command of the Empress Dowager. the consort was deceased. The reaction that followed is one of the most enduring and dramatic elements of the entire story. It was, allegedly, a complete and terrifying breakdown of the imperial persona. The Son of Heaven, the impassive, semi-mindless divine arbiter of the world, vanished. In his place was a man consumed by a grief so violent it bordered on madness. The accounts speak of a great, animalistic cry of anguish that echoed through the courtyards, a sound that violated every precept of imperial decorum. This initial shock quickly curdled into a volcanic rage. But the rage was impotent, for it had no legitimate target. He could not, in any meaningful way, punish the eunuchs who had carried out the order. They were merely instruments of a higher will. He could not execute the ladies minus in minus waiting who had been witnesses. They were blameless. His fury, denied its true object, turned inward and outward upon his immediate surroundings. Stories describe him overturning tables, smashing priceless ceramics, and tearing the silk hangings from their fixtures. These were the actions of a man trapped in a prison of his own making, a monarch whose absolute power had created a system that could be turned against him with devastating effect. The inevitable confrontation with his mother was the final, crushing act of his defeat. He stormed to her palace, his grief and rage lending him a momentum that no courtier would dare impede. But the Empress Dowager was an immovable object. She met his fury not with fear or apology, but with the cold, unyielding logic of her position. She was not his subordinate, she was his mother. She had not acted out of malice, she would have explained, but out of duty to the ancestors, to the dynasty, and ultimately to him. She had removed a threat, excised a cancer, and restored order. She had done what he, blinded by infatuation, had been unwilling or unable to do. Every accusation he made, she would have parried with the unanswerable question, "Was your desire more important than the security of the throne?" He had no answer. He was checkmated by the foundational principles of his own authority. To punish his mother would be an act of supreme filial impiety, a crime that would delegitimize him in the eyes of the entire empire. He, who could order the death of any other person in his realm with a single word, could not touch the one person responsible for his agony. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was utterly powerless, a broken man, his rage extinguished, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of his loss. The collector had been robbed of his most prized possession, and the thief was the one person from whom he could never reclaim it. His authority was absolute, but it was not infinite. He had finally discovered its limit, and the cost of the lesson was the very thing he had valued most. The image of the grief-stricken emperor, a man of absolute power reduced to impotent rage by the death of his world obsession, is the emotional climax of the legend. It is a powerful and enduring tableau, a tragic opera in miniature that seems to provide a fittingly dramatic end to a dramatic story. It is the narrative capstone, the moment that solidifies the Fragrant Concubine's status as a figure of immense, world-altering significance. However, like the story of the Senton, the concealed dagger, this powerful scene dissolves upon contact with the cold, dry pages of the imperial archives. The historical record, in its dispassionate and meticulous detail, tells a story that is not only different, but is, in its quiet way, even more unsettling. The woman known to history as Consort Zhuang did not die by forced suicide in the 1760s at the command of the Empress Dowager. The official records of the King Court are unambiguous on this point. Consort Zhuang died of natural causes, likely an illness, on the 24th of May, 1788. She was 50-4 years old. She had lived within the walls of the Forbidden City for 20-8 years, more than half of her life. The narrative of her violent death, which forms the very heart of the tragic legend, is a complete fabrication. Her life in the palace, as reconstructed from the administrative records of the Imperial Household Department, was not one of perpetual defiance and melancholic isolation. It was, by all available metrics, a life of quiet, privileged stability and considerable imperial favor. Her gradual promotion from noble lady to imperial concubine and finally to consort, a process that took 8 years, is evidence of a sustained and positive relationship with the emperor. This was not the career path of a woman who met her sovereign with a concealed dagger and a silent rebuke. It was the path of a successful and well-regarded courtier. The records show that she was a regular participant in the life of the inner court. She accompanied the emperor on several of his imperial inspection tours, including a journey to the south and visits to the ancestral Manchu homeland in Manchuria. These were not casual excursions. Inclusion in the emperor's traveling retinue was a significant honor, a public mark of high favor. The imperial kitchen archives confirm that she regularly received special provisions of foods from her native region, such as honeymelons and other fruits, indicating the emperor's long-term and consistent attentiveness to her comfort. This historical fact is likely the kernel of truth from which the much grander legend of the recreated bazaar was later spun. Far from being an isolated pariah, she appears to have been an integrated, if culturally distinct, member of the imperial household's upper echelon. Her relationship with the emperor was not a tragic battle of wills, but a long, stable, and seemingly placid association that lasted for nearly 3 decades. The narrative of her unyielding resistance is simply not supported by the evidence of her lived reality. Her death in 1788 was met not with a storm of imperial rage, but with the orderly and respectful protocols befitting a high-ranking consort. Upon her passing, the Qianlong Emperor, then in his late 70s, ordered that all court business be suspended for 3 days as a sign of mourning, a standard but significant honor. He personally attended a libation ceremony in her memory. The records detailed his specific instructions for her funeral arrangements, which were to be conducted with the full honors due to a fay. He ordered that her coffin be interred in the Eastern King tombs, in the consort mausoleum that lay adjacent to his own future burial site. Over 100 of her personal items were catalogued and ritually burned as offerings for her spirit. This is not the behavior of an emperor grieving a woman whose existence had caused a dynastic crisis and who had been murdered by his own mother. Procedurally correct response of an aging monarch to the peaceful death of a long-favored companion. The historical record is unambiguous. The life of Consort Trong was not a short, tragic opera. It was a long, quiet, and ultimately uneventful career in the imperial harem. This leaves us with a profound and necessary question: if the reality was one of quiet integration into peaceful death, why was the violent, tragic legend of the defiant martyr born? Why did it prove so much more powerful than the truth? The chasm between the historical record and the popular legend is not the result of a simple clerical error or a gradual fading of memory. It is the product of a deliberate, if not centrally coordinated, process of cultural and political myth-making. The figure of Consort Trong, the successful courtier, was systematically replaced by the martyr Xiang Fei because the legend fulfilled a series of profound narrative, political, and psychological needs that the quiet historical truth could not, in every sense, more useful than the courtier. First and most fundamentally, the legend is a superior story. Human consciousness is drawn to patterns of high conflict, tragic romance, and cathartic release. The historical life of Consort Trong lacks the compelling dramatic arc. It is a story of successful adaptation, integration, and a peaceful end. It offers little in the way of conflict or moral clarity. The legend of Xiang Fei, by contrast, is a perfectly structured tragedy. An antagonist, the obsessive emperor and his ruthless mother, a central, irresolvable conflict, freedom versus possession, and a powerful, tragic climax, forced suicide. It is a narrative that generates strong emotions, pity, admiration, outrage, and is therefore far more memorable and transmissible than the mundane administrative record of a consort's life. Oral traditions, popular operas, and folk ballads, the primary vectors for storytelling in pre-modern societies, thrive on such dramatic material. They are mediums that naturally filter out ambiguity and administrative detail, refining a story over time to its most potent emotional core. Second, the legend served as a potent vehicle for Han Chinese political dissent against the ruling Manchu Qing dynasty. The story began to gain widespread popularity in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of intense internal decay and external pressure for the king, culminating in the rise of revolutionary, anti-intellectuals and nationalists. For Han intellectuals and nationalists, the story of Xiang Fei was a perfect allegory for their own political struggle. Was cast in the role of a decadent foreign tyrant, his obsession with the captive a symbol of the dynasty's moral corruption. Xiang Fei, though Uyghur, was subsumed into a broader, generalized identity of a Chinese subject resisting the oppression of a barbarian ruler. Her defiance and ultimate suicide were interpreted as a patriotic act, a refusal to submit to an illegitimate, foreign regime. In this context, her martyrdom was not personal, it was political, a symbolic representation of the indomitable spirit of the conquered people. Third, the story holds a different but equally powerful significance for the Uyghur people themselves. In their cultural memory, Xiong Fei is not an abstract symbol of anti-Manchu sentiment, she is a specific daughter of their homeland, a historical figure who embodies their own experience of conquest and the struggle to maintain their cultural identity. In this interpretation, her story is a foundational narrative of resistance to assimilation. Her refusal to abandon her native dress, her adherence to her diet, and her spiritual isolation in the Forbidden City are seen as acts of cultural preservation. Her suicide is the ultimate act of defiance, a statement that death is preferable to the loss of one's identity and submission to a foreign power. She becomes a national heroine, a martyr not for a pan-Chinese identity, but for the specific identity of her own people. The legend serves as a vessel for collective historical trauma, preserving the memory of their subjugation through the powerful, personalized story of a single woman. Finally, the legend resonates on a universal psychological level, transcending its specific political contexts. It is a story about the gilded cage, a timeless metaphor for the conflict between material security and spiritual freedom. It speaks to the fundamental human desire for autonomy and the idea that the inner self, the soul, cannot be truly owned or controlled by an external power, no matter how absolute. The emperor can command her physical presence, but he cannot command her love or her will. Her story becomes a powerful fable about the limits of power and the indestructible nature of the human spirit. These four forces, the power of tragic narrative, Han political appropriation, Uyghur cultural martyrdom, and universal psychological archetypes, worked in concert to elevate the legend and erase the history. The historical consort Trum was a specific person who lived and died within a particular set of circumstances. The legendary Xiong Fei became a symbol, and a symbol is infinitely more flexible and powerful than a person. It can be filled with the hopes, fears, and political aspirations of successive generations, taking on new meanings to serve new purposes. The world needed a martyr, and so a martyr was made. The final echo of a life is often found in the disposition of the body. In the case of the woman from Alti Shah, her death, like her life, is bifurcated, leaving behind two distinct and competing physical legacies, each serving a different narrative. One is a matter of historical record, located in the heart of the imperial Manchu world she was forced to inhabit. The other is a matter of legendary faith, a symbolic reclamation located in the homeland she was forced to leave behind. The historical truth places her final resting place in the Eastern King tombs, a vast imperial necropolis located in Ziyuan, Hua, about 75 miles northeast of Beijing. This was the sacred burial ground for the Manchu emperors of the Qing dynasty. Within this complex lies a smaller, subsidiary mausoleum designated for imperial consorts, the Yufei Mausoleum. It is here, amongst the tombs of other consorts of the Qianlong and Kangxi emperors, that consort Trong was interred. Its location documented in the meticulous records of the Imperial Household Department. In 1929, when a group of warlords plundered the tomb complex, her crypt was among those broken into. The archaeological examination of the remains and artifacts confirmed the identity of the occupant as a high-ranking consort of non-Han origin, consistent with the historical profile of consort Trong. Her physical body, therefore, completed its journey by being permanently assimilated into the imperial structure of her captors. She remains, in death as in life, a possession of the dynasty, a satellite body in orbit around the great tomb of her emperor. However, the legend demands a different, more emotionally satisfying conclusion. It requires her return, and so a second, far more famous tomb exists nearly 3,000 miles to the west in Kashgar, the heart of her former homeland. This is the Afak Koja Mausoleum, a stunning masterpiece of Islamic architecture dating back to the 17th century. It is the holy shrine and burial place of a revered Sufi master and his descendants, The very clan to which the historical consortium belonged, amplified and codified over the centuries, insists that this is the true resting place of Xiang Fei. The story holds that after her forced suicide, her body was transported from Beijing back to Kashgar in a heroic, clandestine journey that took over 3 years, a procession of devoted followers carrying her across the breadth of the empire to be buried with her ancestors. This narrative is logistically improbable and historically unsubstantiated, but its symbolic power is immense. The journey is a reverse image of her initial forced march to Beijing, a posthumous act of liberation. Her burial in the family shrine is a rejection of her imperial identity and a reclamation of her true self. It allows her in death to achieve the escape that was denied to her in life. The Kashgar provides the legend with a physical anchor, a site of pilgrimage where the story of the martyr can be venerated as a sacred truth. Today, both sites exist as tourist attractions, and in their presentation, the conflict between history and legend is made manifest. The tomb in the King necropolis is a minor historical footnote, a point of interest for specialists. The mausoleum in Kashgar, however, has become a major destination, often promoted by the Chinese state itself. Inside the shrine complex, a specific tomb is designated as hers, and the tragic story of her life and defiance is recounted for visitors. The narrative is often subtly reshaped, framed not as a story of conquest and resistance, but as one of national unity, a tale of a minority woman who became a beloved consort of a great Chinese emperor. The tragic edges are softened, the political resistance is downplayed, and the story is repurposed to serve a modern political agenda. And so her legacy remains contested. Her bones lie in the cold, imperial soil of Hebei, a final, quiet fact. But her spirit, the potent, adaptable legend of Xiang Fei, resides in the warm desert air of Kashgar, a story that continues to echo because it tells a truth more profound than any mere fact. And so we are left here in the quiet space between the archive and the ballad, between the documented life of Consort Trong and the eternal martyrdom of Xiang Fei. What does this gap, this chasm between truth and legend tell us? It suggests, perhaps, that history is not a static record of what was, but an active, ongoing negotiation of what is needed. The legend of the Fragrant Concubine persists, not because it is factually accurate, but because it is psychologically true. It speaks to a deeper reality about the nature of power. It illustrates that the impulse to collect, to own, to possess another human being, is ultimately an exercise in futility. The Qianlong Emperor, in all his glory, could acquire the body, but he could never capture the intangible, defiant essence of the individual soul. The story serves as a quiet, perennial warning. A warning that the most beautiful cage is still a cage, and that the will to be free, or to define the terms of one's own end, is a force that even the Son of Heaven cannot extinguish. It is a testament to the fact that what we remember of the past is often a mirror, reflecting not the precise details of a forgotten life, but the enduring truths of our own. The end of the article.